Hello, everyone, and very warm welcome to this week's Sunday Symposium. This week is all about history, and in particular, since we've all been self isolating in one way or another in the UK, we're going to be talking about what we can learn from isolationism in history. So, a history focus this week, and I'm joined by fellow historian Neil Martin. Hi, Neil.
Hi there, Jacob. How you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Would you be able to tell us, Neil, just a bit about yourself and your kind of historical specialism, please?
Yeah, well, that's that. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for the sort of salubrious introduction there, Jacob. That's your humour is infectious. So yes, I am. My name is Neil Martin. I've been a history teacher now for around 15 years. Always had a sort of fascination in the subject. Obviously, otherwise I wouldn't be teaching it, I suppose. My own personal interests are relatively varied. Certainly, in the past, I focused a lot on Asian history, particularly history of Japan, India and China over about the last 250 odd years. But of late, actually, over the past sort of maybe decade or so, I've started to sort of really develop an interest in 17th, 18th and 19th century Germany, France and Britain. So slight sort of eclectic interests there. Yes,
Well,
that's where I've sort of been heading.
Well, that's great. That contrasts quite nicely with my own focus
Thank
on
you.
the Middle Ages and things like that. So hopefully between us we can get a
Absolutely.
broad,
Yeah.
holistic historical worldview. So let's start off by talking about this word isolationism. What does it mean in in the context of the period that you specialise in, which is the 18th and
Mm.
19th centuries?
Yeah, I mean, I think, sort of if you look at, I've got two sort of examples here, and I think actually when I was sort of trying to put some stuff together, I found this question, or that we were thinking about the idea of has the meaning of isolationism changed over time? So, I mean, I think sort of the first example I would give you is Isolationist Japan,
Mm.
and sort of the Japanese state, if you like, in the 17th century. We get this self-imposed isolation, and it's referred to, or the policy is referred to as sakoku, which is introduced around about 1633. And the word sakoku actually means closed country, roughly sort of translated from the Japanese there.
Mm.
And that is begun by the leader, I suppose the shogun of Japan in this period. There was an emperor, but he was very much not part of day-to-day life. He was perceived as a living god, and far too important to be part of everyday life. So actually this is introduced by Tokugawa Iemitsu, who actually encourages this policy through a number of edicts from 1633 to 1639. Now, actually, it's that idea of being a closed country is slightly misleading, because it is actually not entirely closed. And actually, there are what are referred to as 5 gateways in Japan in this period, where actually there is trade with foreign powers right throughout this period, and until this sort of isolation period ends. And we've got trade there with obviously major neighbours such as China being very much the sort of apex power in Asia in this period, and Korea and Vietnam, even Siam. But also later on, the Dutch East India Company are allowed to trade with the Japanese into the sort of 17th and 18th centuries.
So
Now the question is here.
because I just wanted to interrupt you there, Neil, because
No, do.
China itself in this period was quite isolationist, wasn't it? Until really the Opium Wars, as far as I'm aware, began to open up or forcibly open up China due to British interest in trade and the British kind of forcing themselves on China in economic terms.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable point. I think it is different in a sense. I mean, China itself there is this belief in China that it is the sort of cultural center of the world. Beijing, which is where the emperor lives effectively, and is as the sort of son of heaven, this autocratic, divinely appointed monarch, perceives Chinese or China itself to be civilized, and anything beyond the boundaries of China to be uncivilized or barbarous. In fact, the idea was that the further you went away from from Beijing, the less cooked you were. So in Beijing, you would be cooked. That would mean to be civilized. And then moving away from that, you'd be sort of slightly less cooked until you were beyond the borders of China, where you would, of course, be raw or uncooked, and you were a barbarian. I think the main difference between China and Japan, in terms of that sort of isolationism, is Japan itself imposes this isolation to protect itself. And actually that's following concern from forays from Spanish and actually more Portuguese Christian missionaries into Japan. So there is a desire here to protect one's culture. Whereas with China, I think there's more of a sort of an arrogance associated with that. It's less of a protection. It's more of a sense of, well, we're isolated because there is literally nothing we would need beyond our borders.
We'll come back to talk about China later, definitely, when we look at kind of the political side of this in the modern world. But it's also worth here bringing in Europe, isn't it? In this period, 16th, 17th century, almost the opposite is going on in Europe, with Spanish expansion, with the kind of nature of empire building. Why do you think that was? Why do you think there was this kind of huge contrast in outlook to other cultures?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question, and I think that is an interesting one for us to sort of pause on and ponder there. If we sort of have that comparative element, I mean, what is it? Why is it that European nations in this period are very much going out, and I suppose, well, it's completely opposite of isolation, as you've said. So what is the difference there? I mean, I think it is a desire to expand, a desire to grow. I think the sort of economic benefits of what is overseas is perceived as important in this period. Whereas to a country like Japan, which is a sizable population even in this period, there is perceived as there isn't this need to go to overseas too much to sort of generate more capital. I mean, it is relatively self-sufficient in terms of what it is producing in this period. So I suppose there isn't almost this drive, or again, maybe it is part of this sort of Asian belief that their culture is that civilized, they are that advanced that there is no need to go beyond their own borders to advance even further. So I think there's an element of that. But as I say, I would sort of pigeonhole Japan in its terms of its isolation as being a sort of a cultural isolationism in this period, ultimately. And of course, that does end after 220 years. So in 1853 to 54, we get America effectively literally forcibly opening Japan to trade. And in fact, actually made that point about the sort of British intervention in China in the 1830s, 1840s with the Opium War. And effectively, it's the same thing. There is this desire to open up Japan to trade. The major difference between Japan and China is actually Japan develops along Western lines very rapidly and is very cautious in its development, whereas China is really sort of, how can we put it, sort of certainly economically pillaged in many respects by Western powers.
Do you think, coming back to this idea of isolationism versus a kind of outward worldview, do you think religion has any role to play in this? Because you mentioned Christian missionaries making their way to China, which they had been doing for centuries, until there was this huge reaction in China, and lots of them were kicked out. And Christian missionary, being a Christian missionary, was part and parcel of spreading European culture as well. Although it was perhaps for many of them it wasn't intended to be like that, but it ended up being like that. So, can we talk a bit about religion in Japan and China? Because my knowledge in that is very limited.
Absolutely, of course. I mean, we can bring, if we're talking about that sort of idea of perhaps some of that impact of sort of Christian missionary work. I mean, really, we get this in Japan to a degree, and this is a real concern. I mean, there is a genuine concern that this religion is a threat to homegrown Japanese religions, so sort of Shintoism, for example, and traditional ancestor worship. And there is a great desire to maintain that because it is seen, I think, or in fact it is seen very much as the core of Japanese society. And I think the point I would try and make there is religion in Japan, and in fact the idea of sort of Confucian cultural values in China are so inextricably linked with day-to-day life. And it's not so much actually, yes, if you were in the West, of course, you were Christian, you would be praying at home, you would have your Bible, you'd be reading from that. But I think it was an ingrained part of everyday life. Every interaction had something to do with this religious element. So it's more than just religion. It's a culture that is also a religion. So I think that's the major difference here. It is a whole way of life that potentially is coming under threat from influence elsewhere. And that is a major concern. So I would argue that to be Japanese in this period was not compatible with being Christian, arguably.
Coming back to the idea of isolationism, then, do you think that Confucianism fit in with this idea of being an isolationist, although the term at that time didn't exist as such?
I mean, I think it's an interesting one. I mean, Confucianism is more of a set of sort of cultural values in China. I mean, the elements of that do spread beyond China's own borders, so to Japan, for example, but not wholesale. But a lot of sort of Confucianism is bound up with filial piety and the sort of respect for one's elders, and the desire to sort of venerate one's ancestors as well, and to be well behaved ultimately. So does that link to isolationism? I suppose there is an argument to suggest that, the sort of the influx of Western ideas, again, is perhaps seen as a threat to the Chinese in this period. I mean, there is the Macartney mission in the late 18th century from Britain that goes to China and is granted an audience with Chinese emperor at this point. But the response is incredibly negative, and it's a sense of, well, actually, if you want to trade with China, we don't want anything from you. We don't need your manufactured goods. And if you're to come here, then we're not going to change. You're going to have to adopt Chinese customs. You're going to have to learn Chinese, which is incredibly difficult for you. You will not be able to do it. So I think there is a sort of binding up there, and a sort of similarity, this desire to maintain and protect without sort of any sort of seditious influence from the West. So I suppose there is a desire there from Confucianism to remain isolationist. Yes, perhaps, actually.
Well, okay, well, we're talking about China. Let's move on to talk about China in the modern world. We've both been reading The New Silk Road, an excellent book by Peter Frankopan, which, if you haven't read, it's definitely worth the read. Just before we talk about it, I should point out that the Silk Road refers to a huge trade network that's kind of existed since the ancient times, really, through Central Asia, across the north of India, from China into Europe, and silk being a major good that was traded along this road, along with lots of other things as well, such as spices, etc. Peter Frankopan's written 2 books on this. One of them is just called The Silk Road, which deals with the kind of history of this trade network. And this more recent one, which came out, I think, a year ago, The New Silk Road, talks about kind of modern day geopolitics, focusing on China. And we've been talking about China within the context of being an isolationist country in the 16th and 17th centuries. If it was then, it certainly isn't now, according to Frankopan. And he makes this argument that in fact China is almost replacing America in being the leader of the modern world, in reaching out to other countries. So first of all, let's start off quite generally then. Neil, what did you make of the role of China in this extract that we read from this book?
Well, I felt it was quite I thought it was incredibly interesting, actually. I mean, the book itself is fabulous, and as you put that incredibly well, it does really sort of paint quite a vivid picture of sort of geopolitics in this period. In terms of China's position and the sort of the parts of that book that we've dipped into for this, I found it interesting in as much that there was a suggestion that actually China is making an effort to promote, actually, as Frankopan puts, this sort of idea of a new understanding of socialism. And also, I think there's an interesting comparison to draw here, sort of historically. We talk about China potentially, we talk about perhaps being slightly isolationist in the 16th and 17th century, certainly to the sort of Western influence. It certainly was, but I think it's also worth noting that China itself was very much an apex power in Asia, but also effectively had homage from other Asian states. So ultimately there would be homage, and effectively there would be a sort of, if you like, a visit to the Chinese emperor for protection by members of the Korean court, the Japanese court, and the Vietnamese court. And actually what struck me in the piece was there was a suggestion actually that China acknowledges that actually for Asian nations across that Silk Road, and this sort of that modern route, they may be different, but actually the fact that they are Asian, there's an opportunity to get along there. So it's almost as if China is reacquiring this sort of guiding hand in the development and I suppose control of that region ultimately as well.
You're absolutely.
As I read it, go on, please.
You're absolutely right. There's this quote that Frankopan brings out from a speech that Xi Jinping, the leader of China, gave in 2017, and he says that he was saying that our real enemy is not the neighbouring country; it is hunger, poverty, ignorance, superstition, and prejudice. So that you're absolutely right. There is this idea that Xi Jinping is reshaping the socialism, which has been part and parcel of Chinese politics for the last few decades. And there's also this sentiment that lots of Chinese academics are researching. I think it's one of the most frequent things now typed into Chinese search engines, which is Xi Jinping thought. And it's to do with
indeed
14 points that Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, has added into the Chinese constitution, along the lines of what I just said earlier about reaching out to, or not making enemies of neighbouring countries, but fighting instead injustice, poverty, ignorance, superstition, and prejudice, etc. So, in this sense, well, according to Frankopan, Xi Jinping is exhibiting this new type of political leadership, which is in quite a contrast to how China has been in the past, in the long term, hasn't it? Because we've been talking about China being quite isolationist in its political worldview in previous centuries. What are your thoughts on that in terms of China making, well, reaching out to other countries along the Silk Road?
I mean, I think, as I read that extract, the impression that I got was one of genuine sort of optimism and a desire to support and assist and help. Frankopan does make that point at a point when he's sort of talking about the sort of the differences between the American and Chinese worldview here. And he talks about China potentially creating an empire either by design or default. So as I read it, I was sort of on the lines of sort of more default, a kind of like sort of influence by accident, maybe sort of a positive sense of expanding that influence. So I found that actually quite interesting. And as I say, it may have been the way that I read that extract. It may have been the way that I was reading what Frankopan was suggesting. But actually, it would appear to me that there was a desire to actually cross borders, to sort of open up markets, to try and sort of afford mutual support from those perhaps more developing nations across the Silk Road itself. And I suppose you could argue that, perhaps that always had been the case, hadn't it? Because I mean, I suppose traditionally the Silk Road it ends in China. I mean, it still does. Ultimately the end is still there. So I suppose if one was on the Silk Road, coming across it, one would be passing through other countries. Ultimately, your goods, hypothetically, you would want them to get to China, or that is where you would want to go to pick this stuff up, hypothetically. Of course, you could trade with other places along the way. So I think the point I'm making is, China is reasserting this sort of position as being this sort of this place to aspire to get to, but also by extension, its influences draws people along there, and they have that opportunity to interact with these other states that are developing across it. And I think China perceives that they almost have a duty to perform this task. And that again is part, I believe, of this extract. It's suggesting what now is the duty for China. And actually, there was another point made in that extract where actually there are some that don't really understand what the vision is for China for the future, or certainly haven't in the last few years. Of course, it's been economic growth, but actually in terms of its status as a world power, what is the Chinese role? And maybe this is it, this sort of supportive, mutually supportive sort of element of it. But of course, it is sort of caveated with these concerns about the Chinese state itself, and their concerns about, people's concerns about in terms of what is being traded off in terms of to develop China along these lines.
So, and one of the other big point that Peter Frankopan makes, of course, is that this is in direct contrast to what's going on in American foreign policy at the moment, which is becoming more and more, or has become more and more isolationist, and potentially this may lead. May take it down the path to conflict with China. One of the quotes from this extract is that one of the lessons that history teaches us is that no generation has a monopoly on peace. And Frankopan gives the example of American oil sanctions on Iran, which indirectly affect China because China imports about a quarter of Iranian oil. So as soon as the oil industry in Iran is disrupted, China is going to feel that in quite a big way as well. So what are your thoughts on that about American isolationism at the moment? Do you think that America will continue to pursue this policy of America first, or do you think that, particularly given recent events with the coronavirus, that may well change?
I think that's an interesting point that you raised there. I mean, I would hope it would actually change. I mean, we sort of have to think about sort of American sort of personal view, American worldview, that idea of sort of capitalism, of making money, of pushing oneself to be the very best that one can be, and that having an opportunity, one can make something of oneself. I suppose it's sort of tied into that sort of the idea of the American dream in that sense. But I think the point I'm trying to make is, there is a sort of a sense in sort of American, as I understand it, certainly American society, of the individual and putting the individual first, ultimately. Now, I think ultimately what is being done in America, the way that it has become more introverted of late, it is of a concern. And I think the extract itself actually suggests, and in fact it does make this point, that actually as perhaps in Asia new connections are being made, or I suppose they're old connections which are being refound along the Silk Road, actually the West is in danger of becoming less relevant. And it makes the point that the spine of the Silk Road, of those countries along that spine, that's sort of China, Russia, Iran, and the peripheries of Pakistan and Turkey, are of course viewed with suspicion by the United States. So actually there is a suggestion there that it is in danger of losing out. And actually this is another point I think that the article makes is, that many nations that are not obviously America or China are almost in danger of having to make a decision. Who are you going to align with at this point? And we're going really from we're becoming very bipolar in our worldview. And sort of these attitudes are forcing people's hands. So which side are you going to go with? So I think, I would hope that, with potential administration change in the future in America, that actually there is more of this effort to get along with what is America's effectively greatest rival. Of course, there is Russia there in the background as well. But actually, surely by getting along and actually engaging together, that can only be of benefit. And I think as well, the extract makes the point that actually when the West, or certainly in America's the example of America, when it has engaged in these regions, of course, it's been to intervene or to place obstacles. And it gives the examples of the Iraq conflict and the problem in the Gulf and the conflict in Afghanistan. It's not been a particularly positive history in terms of certainly US engagement in the Middle East. And you could argue British as well in French in the past.
Absolutely. I think on that note, though, I think it's worth pointing out here that, and Frankopan makes this point too in the book, is that lots of these countries along the Silk Road, which China has been reaching out to, do not have a good record on, say, human rights, and most of them are not liberal democracies. And part of the issue with kind of America's retreat into itself under the kind of America first foreign policy with Trump, and this has been going on before Trump, really, under Obama as well, is that there's going to be the future of the world is not going to be one of where liberal democracy predominates by any means. It's going to be potentially the opposite. And if a country is falling behind in terms of its economic development, what tends to happen, this is another of Frankopan's points, that it focuses on developing its infrastructure and commerce and industry rather than on developing things such as human rights or environmentalism or its or liberal democracy or its politics in that way. So
I think that is a good point. Of course, I think it was Putin who recently said that the age of liberal democracy or Western style liberal democracy is now dead, or is certainly in danger of dying. And it's quite a sort of a sobering thought, actually, to think that one can sort of champion the sort of industrial development and ignore human rights, environmental protection, and so on and so forth. And it is a shame that we get this sort of selfish nature, and the selfish nature of the individual, and of course in this case individual states, does override perhaps something that could be much more progressive and much more positive globally.
Finally, then, let's move on to the final question here, which is coming back to the question we started with about isolationism. Then, what, if anything, can we learn from isolationism in history? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, this has been a fantastic topic to really sort of look into and even research sort of quite relatively briefly, but it has been fantastic. I suppose the question there is sort of what can we learn from it? I mean, I think we have to ask ourselves, have there been any wholly positive benefits of isolationism in history? Now, certainly, I gave you the example of Japan. We've looked at, certainly just pausing briefly on those two countries again, that isolationism effectively is ended at the barrel of a gun. Japan is forced into a sort of a US-Japanese treaty. We have the Opium Wars in China, and that's when China starts to become carved up by Western powers. I think, what can we learn from it? I can, and unfortunately, it promotes that sort of introverted look. It promotes a sort of quite a selfish worldview, and I think ultimately it can. Well, certainly, as I say, the examples that I've given, it can only breed conflict. I would struggle, and again, of course, I am only looking at two subjects and perhaps a couple more, but I would struggle certainly to perceive isolationism as producing something wholly positive. I'm not sure. What do you
play
think
devil's advocate a bit here? I mean, empire building and intervention in countries such as Afghanistan and Iraq in recent times, it's not been viewed on as a force for good by much of the world's media and global attention, which has been on those issues. I mean, certainly now we don't look back on the days of the British Empire. Well, it's not generally in the line of kind of modern academic thought to look back on the days of the British Empire and wish they returned, is it? So
No.
kind of the opposite of isolationism is viewed well with just as negative a lens, and perhaps this is just the problem of that there aren't such things as good forces of good and forces for bad in history.
That's an interesting point. I mean, I suppose the sort of the opposite. So you're suggesting that the opposite of sort of isolationism is sort of opening up of countries and the sort of domination of those states by others. Is that the point you were?
Well, generally speaking, when countries have been outward looking in the past, it's difficult to think of an example of a time when that hasn't resulted in something like colonialism or at least cultural dominance. I mean, of course, with America, America's not been, well, some can contest this, but it's not been a colonial power. But of course, it has had worldwide dominance. I mean, particularly looking at the end of the Cold War. If you look at after the first Gulf War, when America was kind of at the height of its political power, you can say that American cultural influence across the world is huge, and it was huge, and it's only grown since then, perhaps up until the last decade.
Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? As much that I suppose that the question and a point potentially it's just worth to sort of pausing and thinking on is we have that sort of there's that cultural influence of a great superpower, and I would agree with you that's certainly been on the up since the 19th, well, I suppose the end of the Second World War, ultimately as well. But I suppose is that at the expense of I suppose indigenous or homegrown cultural activity ultimately?
Well, it's worth perhaps coming back to the book that was written by Francis Fukuyama at the end of the Cold War, saying that this was the end of history now, that it was dominated by one superpower, which was America. And of course, we've moved on from that world quite considerably now to seeing what Frankopan points out to be the rise of China with the development of the new Silk Road, and China perhaps replacing America as the world superpower, along with, of course, Russia as well, but Russia not nearly as economically dominant as China is today. And on the note of isolationism, perhaps drawing this to a close, is that if we can learn anything from states looking within themselves, it's normally due to, well, either underlying cultural issues that are going on in that country, such as you were saying with China and Japan in the 16th and 17th centuries, but in more recent times with things like Brexit and America First, that's generally been because of the economy, and been since the 2008 financial crisis that it's resulted in more isolationist foreign policies as Western countries have generally had to look inside themselves and try to work out their own problems.
And I think that's an interesting point, sort of certainly just touching just sort of back there, and let's look back in history very briefly there in terms of the 2008 crisis and of course the economic problems that will be caused by the current pandemic. I mean, it is concerning that countries have become more insular looking, but of course this is exactly what happened during the Great Depression, and we all know what that led to a few years later, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, on that sobering note, we'll draw this discussion
to
an end. But it's been a pleasure discussing this with you, Neil, and thank you very much for taking part.
Thank you, Jacob. It has been an utter pleasure. I hope to do so again in the future.